Han Solo's story reaches completion not with a sudden revelation, but with a gradual settling, a quiet alignment between who he has been pretending to be and who he has already become. And by the time the original trilogy concludes, that alignment is stable, affirmed, and closed, leaving no unresolved internal contradiction, demanding further exploration, which is precisely why the ending feels earned rather than abrupt. By the close of The Empire Strikes Back, Han has already crossed the emotional threshold that defined his entire journey, choosing people over escape and commitment over mobility, not because circumstances force him, but because he wants to stay. And that distinction matters because it marks the end of his defining conflict rather than a pause in it. The final movement of Return of the Jedi does not introduce new internal questions for Han. It provides closure, allowing him to exist within the identity he has already earned, reinforcing his loyalty to Leia Organa, his bond with Luke Skywalker, and his place within the rebellion as a choice rather than an obligation. This closure is important because Han's arc was never about ideology or destiny. It was about emotional access, about whether someone conditioned to survive alone could allow himself to be needed without running. And once that question is answered, the story has no ethical or psychological justification to reopen it, ending his journey where it does honours the integrity of that arc, because it allows growth to remain permanent, a transformation that sticks rather than resets, and that permanence is what separates character development from mere episodic change, anchoring Han's identity in choice rather than circumstance. The problem introduced by later continuations is not that Han returns, but that his return requires the narrative to undo the very stability that defined his ending, peeling back layers of growth so that familiar behaviours can be reactivated, reframing evolution as a temporary phase rather than a lasting shift. To make Han function again as a dramatic engine, the story strips away the commitments that completed him, isolating him emotionally and narratively, so that his old cynicism can be reintroduced as texture, even though that cynicism was already resolved, not because it was uninteresting, but because it was no longer true. This is not organic regression, it is narrative backtracking, a deliberate reversal designed to recreate a recognizable version of the character, prioritizing audience memory over character logic, and in doing so transforming past mistakes into defining traits rather than obstacles he overcame. The Han who chose love, loyalty, and responsibility would not logically abandon them without profound internal justification. Yet the story offers no such reckoning, only implication, skipping the emotional labour required to dismantle a completed arc and presenting the result as a fait accompli by collapsing decades of unseen life into a single assumption of failure. The narrative treats growth as fragile and temporary, suggesting that resolution is provisional, at best, and that characters inevitably revert to their most marketable state, regardless of the meaning previously established. This approach reframes Han not as a man shaped by his choices, but as a collection of traits that can be rearranged to fit narrative need, reducing a carefully constructed arc into a set of reusable components. Charm here, cynicism there, loyalty when convenient, detachment when drama is required. In doing so, the story subtly redefines Han's identity around his lowest point rather than his highest achievement, allowing earlier flaws to eclipse later maturity, and positioning his past mistakes not as chapters he closed, but as defaults he can never truly escape. The tragedy of this reframing is that it misunderstands what made Han compelling in the first place, because his appeal was never that he was a loner, but that he chose not to be one, and that choice was meaningful precisely because it was permanent, not provisional. When permanence is removed, choice loses weight, and when choice loses weight, character loses gravity, leaving behind a figure who looks familiar but feels hollow, recognizable but misaligned with his own history. Rather than building on the foundation laid by the original trilogy, this approach flattens it, turning resolution into setup and closure into inconvenience, all to justify a return that demands sameness over coherence. This is where the tension between honouring a finished story and extending a franchise becomes unavoidable, because one requires respecting growth, while the other often requires resetting it, setting the stage for a version of Han that exists less as a continuation and more as a reconstruction. When the sequels reintroduce Han Solo, the shift is immediately apparent, not because he is older or wearier, but because the narrative has quietly repositioned him away from consequence and toward comfort, presenting a version of the character designed less to continue a journey than to trigger recognition, and that distinction defines everything that follows. In Star Wars: The Force Awakens, Han's presence functions primarily as reassurance, a familiar voice and posture meant to anchor the audience emotionally while the new story finds its footing. And in doing so, the film treats his characterization as a stable icon, rather than a living continuum, leaning on what he represents instead of interrogating who he has become. This approach transforms Han into emotional shorthand, where a single line of dialogue or gesture substitutes for development, allowing the story to communicate tone instantly without investing in progression. But that efficiency comes at a cost because it trades depth for immediacy and continuity for nostalgia. By positioning Han as the recognizable rebel smuggler once again, the sequels implicitly prioritize memory over logic, restoring surface traits that audiences associate with him, while sidestepping the internal resolution that made those traits meaningful in the first place, flattening growth into aesthetic rather than experience. His role also crowds the narrative space around newer characters, particularly figures like Rey and Finn, who might have benefited from carrying the thematic weight of discovery and commitment themselves, but instead orbit a legacy figure whose presence absorbs attention and emotional authority by default. Rather than allowing these new protagonists to struggle into meaning on their own terms, the story repeatedly leans on Han to validate the world, using his familiarity as a stabilizer, which delays the moment when the new generation must stand without inherited gravity. This reliance reveals a deeper creative anxiety, a reluctance to fully sever the emotional, umbilical cord to the original trilogy, resulting in a narrative that gestures toward progression while constantly glancing backward for reassurance, with Han positioned as the bridge that prevents true departure. The culmination of this strategy arrives in Han's death, a moment framed as tragic and profound, yet whose impact relies almost entirely on accumulated affection from earlier films rather than on development within the sequels themselves, making the scene powerful but externally sourced. The confrontation with Kylo Ren resonates not because of what the sequels built, but because of what the audience already knows about Han's capacity for love and forgiveness, effectively borrowing emotional capital rather than generating it anew. This borrowing underscores the central issue, that Han's return exists to evoke legacy rather than extend narrative, and his death serves as punctuation for nostalgia rather than culmination of a newly articulated arc, closing a loop that was already closed instead of opening a new one. In this context, the tragedy is not that Han dies, but that his final act is framed around what he used to mean rather than who he is allowed to be now, reducing his presence to a symbolic sacrifice rather than a lived conclusion grounded in ongoing growth. The sequels thus treat Han as an artifact of Star Wars itself, a living reminder of tone and texture whose purpose is to smooth transition rather than challenge direction, reinforcing familiarity at moments when uncertainty might have allowed something new to emerge. This artifact framing also limits the thematic range of the story, because icons are meant to be preserved, not interrogated, and once Han becomes emblematic rather than exploratory, the narrative can no longer ask uncomfortable questions of him without risking audience alienation. In choosing safety over synthesis, the sequels ensure that Han remains beloved, but they also ensure that he remains static, existing in a loop of recognition that prioritizes comfort over coherence and remembrance over consequence. The irony is that Han Solo's legacy was strong enough to stand without reinforcement, because his arc concluded with clarity and permanence, and leaving it intact would have honored both character and audience trust, allowing the new saga to build forward rather than circle back. Ultimately, Han did not need to return to validate Star Wars, because Star Wars had already been validated by his completed journey, and preserving that completion would have strengthened the myth rather than diluted it. Han Solo did not need more screen time, more conflict, or a final sacrifice to matter. He needed the story to respect the fact that some journeys end cleanly, and that legacy is sometimes best preserved by letting it remain finished rather than reopening it for reassurance.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.